In this video, we'll be talking about the competitive analysis section. In advance, I would like to apologize if there are any noises in the background. In my area, there are fireworks for about a week after the 4th of July, and unfortunately, I could not remove them post-edit. Alright, so, why is the competitive analysis section what separates good from great papers? A business that understands its competitors is going to understand itself. The competitive advantage section signals to judges that not only have you studied the marketplace closely, but all of your decisions have been based on informed research. And there's a lot of power to be found in that. This is where your positioning will become more credible, and it takes shape, not just through what you do, but through what others do, and how you have adapted in kind. We'll be looking at 4 main segments in this video: how to choose your competitors, what insights you should be taking away, how we frame the argument, and finally, how we convey the big picture to the judge in a way that leaves them floored, absolutely amazed by your persuasive argument. At the end of the day, that's what a deck of paper is. It's a glorified persuasive essay with prettier graphics. Additionally, I'd like to apologize because my dog, who's afraid of fireworks, has just wandered in, and if I don't leave my door open, he'll be scratching at it. So if you hear noises, that will be Bongo. He's super cute. I'll leave a photo in the caption. Now, let's start off with talking about our competitors. We always want to keep one thing in mind. Our competitors not only have to be similar, but they also have to be relevant. If we have a small coffee shop and we choose to compare to 3 other small coffee shops, sure, it might be helpful, but it'll get boring. We always want to look at this from different facets, and that's where the idea of choosing 2 to 3 different competitors come from. For each of these, each competitor should have a distinct role. In a persuasive essay, we don't want to repeat the same argument over and over. Instead, we use a variety of perspectives to make our argument more effective. For the sake of this video, let's assume that we're a small florist that primarily delivers flowers to weddings. Additionally, let's say that we have really strong online delivery and booking software already set up for our customers. The first company that we're going to look at is the direct competitor. They sell similar products and services to the same audience. Here, we have to focus on proximity, pricing, features, and visibility. This usually is enough to help us figure out the perfect or close enough direct competitor to look at. For example, with our scenario in mind, let's look at this. Leaf House is a boutique florist located 1 mile away, targeting the wedding market. They price their arrangements 20% higher than ours and do not offer delivery or digital booking. The direct competitor comparison clarifies how your business measures up in cost, convenience, and service. In terms of cost, we're probably beating Leaf House because we're cheaper. For convenience, locationally, there's not much of a difference in 1 mile, but the fact that we have online delivery and booking is going to make us more attractive from a convenience perspective. In this little example here, service is the only trait that is hard to determine with who is better with the information given. As a boutique, they may be more upscale and thus have more attentive customer service, but that's not necessarily always a given with boutiques. Anyway, regardless of if we can answer the question of who is better in terms of service, this is still a good direct competitor to look at. Next up is we have the indirect competitor. Here, we want to pick a company that solves the same customer problem, but they have a different format or delivery method. Same scenario still in mind. Florabox sells subscription-based DIY floral kits to remote couples who are planning budget-conscious ceremonies. Their packaging and affordability appeals to a hands-on, digital-first audience. The best thing about an indirect competitor is that it shows your understanding of customer motivations and cross-industry influences. A direct competitor analysis can struggle to do so because it's so similar to your company and it would miss the mark. The indirect competitor, because it has a different delivery method for the service or product, you're able to see a different perspective. And finally, the third company we look at is the aspirational market leader. This is going to be a company that has been recognized for best practices or innovation in our space, or in a related industry, if that's the way we want to go. Here, we always want to choose one that helps us guide our own growth decisions. When we say growth, this is not necessarily year 1, but maybe further down the line. This might stay in your drafting stages, but it's always good to think about it, because if you could see how a tried and true company has done it, you may be able to apply that to your brainstorming, research, and eventually your drafting. In this case, Urban Stems operates nationally with a focus on speed, brand voice, and digital experience. We study their time delivery system and online checkout process to shape our own service roadmap. Judges will take note of this competitor because it helps us demonstrate that we have a growth mindset. Additionally, and a little bit more cynically, it helps us with professional benchmarking. Judges have no necessary requirement of themselves to necessarily believe in our problem. When we're learning from the aspirational market leader, we always want to acknowledge that we're building off of their weaknesses, which, by the way, should be based in research, but that doesn't automatically mean that we're the company all of our customers will switch to. And that leads us to the next little section of this video, which is avoiding straw man competition. Your competitors have earned their market share for a reason, and acknowledging this shows that you're understanding the reality of the competitive environment, and you're not just building a fantasy business. You won't come out of the gate swinging and making hundreds of thousands of dollars immediately. That's just not realistic. Judges can tell when a student is exaggerating or misrepresenting a competitor to make their own business model look stronger. Combine that with the fact that students often use too large or name brand of companies when they're making their comparisons, and it makes it even easier for a judge who may have actually encountered this brand already to flag it. Instead, we always want to focus on our credible analysis. We want to highlight the strengths of our competitors and answer one main question: how did they earn their market share? Because clearly they're doing something well if they're really large. And in following this, we can position ourselves not as better overall, but we're better for the audience and their goals, especially when we're looking at a captive market, or if there is known market or customer inertia. An aspirational competitor comparison is often a really strong way to back up your argument. However, make sure that straw man competition is not being applied to any of your competitors, but especially we're looking at the aspirational market leader. Next up is we're talking about what to compare. The reason competitor comparisons carry weight is because they're focusing on the business strategy. More specifically, it's based in reality and research. Generally speaking, you want it to be angled more towards the quantitative rather than qualitative backing, but some of these will lend themselves more effectively to qualitative, so don't worry too much about it. Just make sure you're not overly generalizing. If you're going with traits like they're more expensive or they have worse customer service, that doesn't help because we want to make sure that we can explain what it means in a deeper context. To do so, we're going to look at some strategic dimensions. Thankfully, there's some pretty common ones to look at. The first up is product and service quality. Keep in mind that quality and pricing are often paired to create a clear value proposition. Price is what you pay, and value is what you get. $20 at a small mom and pop's cafe might get you an extra large serving of food, but probably that wouldn't go as far at an upscale restaurant. With market share, if we have data or estimates, we want to describe how the market has been divided. This adds context to your growth potential and is especially important when you're looking at markets that may have a history of being hostile to new companies. This ties back to that first idea of price being what you pay and value being what you get, but we want to explain whether each business uses a premium pricing, penetration pricing, value-based pricing, etc., and why that matters to the customer. If it's an established business and they have a certain way of pricing, there may be lessons to be learned there that can inform our own model. Generally speaking, students will lack in-depth research here, and they will default to that whole they're more expensive or we are cheaper sort of standpoint. Specifically pointing out the type of pricing strategy here is the benefit. Next up is target market. We always want to clarify who each business is designed to serve. Even between your 2 or 3 competitors that you're looking at, chances are they're not going to be perfectly targeting the exact same user persona. A difference in audience is often an explanation why the strategies will diverge. For example, if I'm appealing to Gen Z consumers, I'll be much more active online and on social media. If I'm appealing to the silent generation, I'd probably use something more traditional, like mailers. Location and distribution is one of the basics because it fits into that geographics, demographics, psychographics, behaviorographics, and it's often overlooked, even if it's one of the 4 cores. Where a business operates will affect its convenience, its reach, and relevance. A small coffee shop just on the corner is going to operate very differently than Starbucks, who has a global presence. Branding and experience is interesting because this is where we're going to compare how the brand feels, not just how it looks. This includes tone, storytelling, even packaging where it's relevant. For example, a hedge fund management firm is going to feel entirely different than a credit union. And this kind of ties back to target market, market share, the quality. Branding and experience sort of takes all of that together, and it talks about the user's perspective of the company with all of these traits in mind. And finally, weaknesses. We always want to choose these observable gaps that are specific. For example, a lack of digital ordering or limited service options. That's great. We want to avoid subjective claims at all costs. If you can get quantitative backing, do so. If you can't, just be aware it puts you on shakier ground. Avoiding subjective claims at all costs avoids the judge potentially asking questions you won't be able to back up with, stats, but it'll also come across as more professional. No one likes the default argument of, well, they're just worse at this than us, because it feels unprepared. The next thing we want to keep in mind is how to reference the competitor scaling models. This is more advanced, and as a result, even if you leave it in your drafts, it's still good to think about. Is your competitor franchising? Are they focusing on expanding online? Are they staying local? Have they abandoned their original brick and mortar and moved to be entirely hybrid or entirely online? We always want to compare these models with our own expansion plan, because if we can explain how their growth method influences our differentiation or our logistics, our judge will be more likely to agree with our plan. Because it shows that you understand that competition is affected by growth, and that your business will be able to hold its ground as the landscape changes, which naturally, of course, leads us into risk, which is the next section, which is strategic competitive insights. Judges are going to be able to expect most competitors to recognize the difference between short-term trends and long-term risks. When you include a future-facing analysis, you can prove your business model is set to endure. It is just a little bit of extra work to set up. In my opinion, completely worth it. Competitive risks will often hide beneath the surface of success. A market might look stable, but external factors can always change customer behavior. They can raise costs, they can disrupt access to materials. Look at the pandemic. That was devastating. While that would be hard to anticipate, anticipating normal market shifts can help signal to your judge that you are prepared to properly respond to crisis. Thankfully, most risks fall into one of the following areas, though there are always exemptions I'd like to point out. First up is market disruptions. This is new business models, declining demand, or shifting customer values. Right now, for example, we are seeing the rise of personalized skincare formula companies in response to customers wanting skincare that fits them or matching their needs. Additionally, K-beauty, which has historically only had shades for fair skin, are finally moving into more diverse shades, mostly spurred on, or mostly encouraged forward by social media influencers who may be with skin tones that were too dark to use K-beauty. It's a fascinating trend, actually, watching how it's evolved. Next up is technology shifts. These are hardware, software, automations, changing social opinions about the way that people buy, sell, or operate within a business. Cybersecurity, for example, is huge right now, especially as new debates are popping up about the ethical sourcing and use of AI, especially where proprietary data is concerned. On that same note, regulatory changes. These are laws and policies that impact the Big Four: operations, hiring, compliance, or fees. On that same note of cybersecurity, many companies that store or handle customer data are being forced to, or have already, dramatically overhauled their best practices within their company. Reputation risk relates to social media backlash, association with controversial figures, negative press. You'll notice in your research that many brands choose to avoid being outright political because it can alienate whole swaths of your customer brand. Other brands have taken stances on social issues that could be seen as political. For example, we could look at Chick-fil-A with their stance about being closed on Sundays due to their owners' beliefs. It's not inherently bad for a brand to take a stance like this, but it will cause there to be talk, and it's just good to keep that in mind. Next up is supply chain volatility. Once again, think back to the pandemic. That was devastating. It put a massive strain on the entire global supply chain, and that forced many businesses to reevaluate how stable they were in times of crisis. We see this be delays, rising shipping costs, regional instability, vendor unreliability. The pandemic's a very extreme example, but it's good to think about the extremes sometimes because they do show up. Labor shortages. This is sort of like supply chain volatility, and this strategic dimension is very much impacted by the overall economy and market, and as a result, it might be harder to plan for. We generally see this with poor retention due to market conditions, difficulty hiring, wage inflations. Sometimes you even see it with changing contracts, where standard procedures for contracts no longer are good enough. Most famously in recent news, large tech companies have started putting more employee quality of life things into their businesses to make it more appealing to work there, even if they couldn't keep up with a higher wage. Environmental risk. These are natural disasters, climate change disruptions, or eco pressures. The lumber industry is facing a growing demand for timber as we continue to expand just as a species, but they can't immediately scale up because they'll deplete the natural forests, which they need to produce lumber and timber that we need for construction and such. As a result, the overall industry is facing this pivoting point where it has to change the way it operates in order to balance that. Financial strain. This is debt, funding gaps, credit issues, poor liquidity. Not much specifically to say there without it being redundant, but it's always good to plan for this. How do you make sure that your company can scale effectively without worrying about these? And finally, this is brand and trust decline. This can be seen with customer backlash due to poor service, inconsistent values, false claims. Once again, there's not much else to say there because it's so wide and all-encompassing, and truthfully, giving more specific examples might be seen a little bit as taking a bias or political, so I'm going to avoid that. You don't need to include all of these different strategic dimensions in your plan, but you do need to show that you've looked beyond your very own storefront. Generally choosing 2 or 3 that apply to your market the most relevantly and describing how you're preparing for those is enough. Technically, doing a future-facing risk analysis is not tied to competitors, and it's not entirely necessary for this section. However, by being able to prepare for something like this, even if you choose to use it as a prop or a complementary material in your presentation, you reinforce the idea that your project will succeed moving forwards, and having a contingency plan like this is a competitive advantage. Not all, in fact, very few projects will decide to include something like this, and it will set you apart. Every risk you name should lead to a business adjustment. We always want to describe how our model is adapting in response. For example, this could include, we expect rising packaging costs due to climate regulations, so we're exploring bulk fulfillment in compostable materials. Or, we anticipate continued labor shortages in food service, so we've built a model that relies on fewer hires and automated prep systems. Or even, with fast fashion facing backlash for waste, our brand emphasizes repairability and long wear durability. All these examples tell your judge that your business is capable of pivoting. They don't need to be long. They can be 1 to 2 sentences as long as they're thoughtful. The customer switch rationale is really interesting, and as a mentor, somebody who looks at a lot of written papers, I wish I would see more of this from students. Customers never just leave a brand just because a new option exists. They switch when their current experience has so much friction that it becomes insurmountable, and they see clear evidence that someone else has solved it more effectively. Generally speaking, this is the logic I would want to see as a judge. First of all, name the friction. Be specific. This is the wait time, the service flow, the quality, the price. This is whatever is actively pushing your customer away, and they no longer are so enamored with your company that they'll put up with it. Next up is explain your alternative. What is it that you're doing differently that directly resolves the friction? Once again, be super specific here. If it's talking about wait time, what in your operations or your policies or your standard operating practices is making that wait time at your business be much more quick or even just tolerable than at the other business? And finally, show your proof. This can take many forms, for example, customer testimonials, prototypes, pre-sales, behavioral data, competitor reviews, or even your own pilot tests. These are really great as props. I wouldn't include that in a full paper. You may not have enough space for that. For example, if we looked at the structure in action, we might say, local customers report frustration with Leaf House's booking system, which requires in-person appointments. Our model includes a digital scheduling tool with same-day confirmation, which 82% of surveyed customers said would increase their likelihood to order. This kind of framing is proving that your offering is not just unique, which is what it needs to be, but it also has such a strong value that it succeeds in pulling those customers away. It tells the judge that you understand the emotional and the functional driver behind customer decisions and that the solution has been designed with intent. At the end of the day, that's all we want from the competitive advantage. We want to see that you understand what is going on with your customers, that you need to finish pulling them away from the competitors. Next, let's go over some basic and pretty common mistakes to avoid that a lot of students tend to make while conducting competitor analysis or setting up the competitive advantage section. First and foremost is choosing national brands without real overlap. A brand like Amazon, Walmart, or Starbucks can share your category, but if your business model or audience isn't completely different, the comparison won't hold. More specifically, anybody who is in any sort of retail is competing against Amazon. At the end of the day, you are guaranteed essentially to be competing against Amazon if you have a product, or some sort of retailer like Temu or Shein, Shine, however you choose to pronounce it. Having them be on your competitor analysis, a lot of students would make the mistake of putting them in market leader or aspirational. It's such a no-brainer. It's not worth including. Maybe put a little bit of effort thinking about it in terms of research so that if a judge asks you a question, you can respond to it, but it's not worth putting in because it's such a no-brainer. Next up is focusing only on your pricing. Your pricing always needs to connect to value, convenience, exclusivity, experience, something like that. Otherwise, only having this be the inclusion feels shallow, and it's not helpful for your judge to get a real feel for how effectively your brand can operate. Additionally, failing to justify your selection. This is one I see a ton in students. Every competitor you name should have a reason for being there. Are they chosen because they're the nearest, they're the fastest growing, or they're the one who is most likely to steal back their clients after they go to you? We want to make it clear. They don't have to be perfect, but they have to be well backed up with reason. And finally, your pricing, your operations, your brand identity, your marketing strategy, they should not just be existing your competitive advantage, they should be existing elsewhere in your plan. Many students choose to leave the competitive advantage till the end. I would actually argue this is one of those sections you want to get done first. Maybe after target markets, maybe after problem, but before solution is finalized. Generally, you want to draft this alongside solution if that's a piece of your rubric you have. All right, framing analysis. We're going to be mostly going over frameworks and visual ways to present your information in the section. First of all, visual tables are great for clarity. We always want to make sure that they're easy to read, and we're wanting to compare them in a column and row format. If you find a different way to portray them, that's totally fine. This is just a pretty easy, pretty common way to do it. When you're labeling your columns, make sure that you're always labeling them with the business names. Not competitor X, not competitor 1, not competitor Z. Use the business names. It should seem kind of common sense, but I see a lot of students do competitor 1, competitor 2, etc. Additionally, vague labels, those are going to remove the accountability from your analysis, and it comes across as unprofessional, and you may have your judge question you on that. Down the left-hand side, we always want to list our strategic comparison points. This is things like pricing strategy, service features, location radius, or hours of operations, customer reviews, brand experience, all that. We want it on the left-hand side in a column format, simply because if you do it as a row format, it's going to come across really squished because you'll have sentences just be compressed down and it won't work really well. We're wanting to cross-compare features and metrics in the visual table as well. Using those simple yet concise visuals are going to enhance the effectiveness and also make it a bit easier to skim. The sweet spot is going to be 2 to 4 competitors with 3 to 5 comparison points. This can be hard to narrow it down, so if you need to go through a couple of iterations before you decide on a final visual table, don't feel bad. Everybody goes through like 5 or 6 drafts. Next up is the competition gap statement formula. This is a structured way to make the logic of that table visible in a really easy format to read. Keep in mind, while this is great for drafting, you should not leave it in this final paragraph format. It'll just come across as a little bit too robotic and stilted. In the research process, it's okay to keep it robotic and stilted, but you want your final paper to flow. And as you can see here, it is, while a competitor offers strength, they fall short on key area. Our business is designed to fill this gap by solution, which forms the foundation of our whatever strategy. This will also help you connect that research to your final decision making. You might logically read at the end and go, that doesn't feel like it makes sense. Always gut check it. This will generally be at the end of your competition analysis or when you're opening up a business strategy section, if that applies to your paper. And finally, let's talk about the big picture. The big picture is going to be talking about positioning. This is finding out where your business stands in the market, because this is really important. Generally speaking, to do this, we're going to want to start by using a framework. This will go after a direct competitor analysis and be looking more at an overall industry. First and foremost is the primary competitor breakdown. This is where we list and assess key players by market reach, pricing, or audience. In short, that would be the competitor analysis. It's just a fancy way to say it's a visual table. Next up is the market share estimation. This is where we're going to estimate or cite how much of the market each competitor controls. Generally speaking, this is only really useful when we're talking about OR papers because you are a pre-established business who already knows who your competitors are. Most students, when they're doing ORs, example for specifically FOR, they're looking at really large companies. Additionally, if you are doing an international business plan and you're entering a very consumer inertia heavy market, this will also show up. Not all of these frameworks fit for every project, so do keep in mind that you should be looking at, does this rationally, logically, gut check fit? Next up is SWOT analysis. You can also go with a PESTLE. This is where you're just looking at your business's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats. Porter's 5 forces. This is supplier power, buyer power, competitive rivalry, threat of substitution, and new market entrants. Would not suggest it for an OR. Any of the entrepreneurship papers, however, would really benefit for this. More specifically, I love to see this in an innovation or a startup business plan. Niche specialization. This one's super fun, and this is defining how your business serves a narrow but underserved group. Generally speaking, you will see market inertia when it is a niche because there are fewer companies. You might see it more like a monopoly or oligopoly, maybe not in the traditional sense, but just because they are the de facto choice. So having a little paragraph about niche specialization can also prevent questions from your judge with, why did you choose such a small market? Next up, you have a proper competitive advantage framework, which is just looking at advantages that can't be easily copied. These are unique logistics, customer experiences, or founder insight. A good way to separate them is to do CCC, customer, company, context. What is it that specifically gives you a customer benefit? For example, maybe you're servicing a niche index or a niche market. So you have an advantage from your customers where they're more likely to support you because there are no other competitors who are worrying about that. And then you've got company, and then company is looking at what are the internal things that are protecting me. For example, you could think about it as a patent will protect me or give me a competitive advantage. And then context. Context can be either like social or competitor. I've seen CCC be interpreted in a couple different ways, and that's looking at the external market and how it's responding to you and why you have a competitive advantage. For example, if your only other competitor is a super large company and they have to be pretty slow with the uptake because there's so much bureaucracy, you'd have a competitive advantage as a smaller company because you can pivot and you can adapt much faster than a large company that kind of has to slog through the bureaucratic process. Or in a context, maybe you're in an area that federally companies who are owned by citizens are more protected, and they're a little bit harsher on foreign companies coming in and opening up shop. We have a couple countries like that. You see that mostly with international business plan, but I digress. And then finally, we have benchmarking, and that's, as we've already established, that's when you just compare your performance or your strategies against the best known players. When you're doing benchmarking, it's best to keep it within your industry or a related industry. But if there are really large companies out there who have unique best practices that really make them succeed, it's okay to go with that as well. And finally, this is the last little section we'll go through, is the comparative quadrant. These are also known as the perception chart. This is just a simple 2D graph, with each axis being a different aspect of the product that is offered by you or competitors. The reason why we do a product and not an overall brand of perception, which you can do, but that's not a comparative quadrant necessarily, is products are much easier to situate. When you're looking at an overall perception chart, the axes will be slightly different. In most DECA papers, because you'll be focusing on it from a more narrow approach, from a product or service standpoint, looking at the way that you will be perceived will gain a lot of benefit for the judge, because they'll also be able to sort of gut check you there. And I know I've said gut check a lot, but much of DECA does come down to common sense. Some really common axes are price versus customization, brand recognition versus niche specialization, tech integration versus human touch, speed versus quality. There's some really interesting other axes that you can find online, and I highly recommend you go read some of the articles that Gartner has posted in like the last few years. There's some really interesting ones up there. Once you place your business and your competitors on the chart, you're going to want to analyze the pattern. If most competitors are clustering in one corner and your business is occupying a different space, that's where you'll typically find a competitive or positioning advantage. An example of this would be using a comparative quadrant to analyze in a market where most competitors lean towards low-cost mass production. Our quadrant placement shows a gap in high touch, mid-price services, exactly where we operate. As always, thank you so much for supporting us. We do have a transcript posted available if you do want the written out version of this. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the chat or go to our anonymous Padlet. The link will be posted as well, and ask there.